A trade regime that was really built when Company A was building widgets and exporting them to Country B, and we all knew what a good was, what a service was, and what the rules were. And now we have a proliferation of trade agreements that are under negotiation, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which includes now 11 countries, including Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, countries in Asia. And data flows are becoming a bigger and bigger part of the business interests that are affected by these trade agreements. And on the flip side, privacy regulations domestically in these countries are perhaps becoming a barrier to trade. So that's the topic of our discussion today. And I'd like to start out by asking Bill to lay out the stakes from the private sector's view in these trade agreements. What are we talking about when we talk about data flows across borders? Is this just cloud computing? Is it something more? What's the issue?
No, it's huge, and it's been a revelation to me. When we first started thinking about this in my organization, which is a trade association that represents global companies, I thought, well, Google cares, Microsoft cares, Facebook cares. And then I was advised very strongly by my manufacturers in particular that a whole bunch more people care than that. Now everybody does everything on the internet. One of our companies, Procter & Gamble, they do their research on the internet. They shift it around the globe to follow time zones. So people are always working 24/7 on research. Pampers has a Facebook page or a Facebook entry. So if you're interested in Pampers, if you want to know something more about baby care, go on there. And by the way, you can order. So you can order on the internet. General Electric sells power plants. They monitor their power plants remotely from the point of manufacture, so they don't have to send somebody out when something breaks. They can diagnose the problem where they are, send the appropriate parts or the appropriate people out to solve the problem much more quickly and much more efficiently and with fewer cross-border problems. These are manufacturing issues. It also has enabled an explosion of what we would call micro-exports. My favorite little old lady in West Virginia who makes quilts. 30 years she's been selling quilts at the farmer's market on the weekend or to her neighbors. Now she goes on eBay and she sells them in Germany, she sells them in France, she sells them all over the place. This is a huge boom in very small exports, all enabled by digital trade, which by the way has also created a boom in the logistics industry, because who likes the quilts the most? UPS, FedEx, and DHL, because they're the ones that have to ship them. And there's a whole host of new documentation work that goes along with that, all online. So there's been really an explosion of usage of the internet, and in a way that transforms the trading system into something very different from what it was even 8 years ago.
Okay. So with that context, Jonathan, you're a trade negotiator. What is it that the United States wants out of this TPP agreement that we hear a lot about, but we don't really know the details of what's in it? What are you trying to accomplish specifically on transnational data flows?
Well, as Bill said, it's obvious that information is the lifeblood of a whole new set of industries that depend on it. What we do in the trade world is generally we focus on the negative. We focus on what are the barriers, what are impediments to people going through. Now, I'm not going to say that privacy per se is a barrier, security is a barrier, but it certainly can be used in a way that impedes trade, and we want to.
Can you give us an example?
Well, one concrete example would be Australia. They've put in place an electronic health record system, as we have. I don't know if Canada is doing this, but due to privacy concerns, due to the fear they couldn't address what they thought, which we agree are legitimate privacy issues, they are insisting that by law, that the data remain in country. Has to be processed in country, has to be stored in country. Is that necessary? I think that's an open question. What we're trying to do is to set up a system where the default is data should move. There's always going to be exceptions. There's always going to be a governments that say, no, I just do not have the trust necessary to allow that to happen. But can't we at least have a system where the default is that it should move, and that you should be able to have a conversation with a government how can I take into account your legitimate needs without blocking the data? So how do we move away from an instinctive governmental reaction, which is simply no?
Okay, well, let me give you an example, though. I understand from Commissioner Stoddard, Jennifer, she says we can call her Jennifer, it's Google, that Canada, in fact, the Canadian government is overhauling its own information technology systems, and it's looking at putting in a requirement that says personal information will have to be held on servers in Canada. So this kind of a local server requirement, is that unfair trade practice? Is that protectionism that'll prevent companies, whether in the United States or any other part of the world, from providing these services because their servers are located elsewhere?
Yes. You go ahead.
Well, I mean, from this perspective,
But
they
under
say
what you're
yes.
negotiating, is that the outcome of what you're trying to negotiate?
It is. I mean, we're proposing a rule that says you shall not require the use of the local servers as a condition for offering the service. Now, I think in the Canada case, the one case I'm aware of, it's actually a government procurement issue. And we do have to segregate government data, which is different. Governments have a different relationship with their citizens than commercial entities, and we think it's an important issue, but that is a bit of a separate issue. But from a commercial perspective, yes. And I'll give you another very concrete example. Vietnam, one of our TPP partners, is in the process of putting forward regulations for how to deal with a whole range of internet services, gaming services, social networking services, email services. And we're not quite sure the reason, but their way of asserting their jurisdiction control potentially a legitimate regulatory needs is to say all the servers for such services have to be in country. And the companies are just not going to be putting servers in every country. They're just not. It's just not a viable approach from an economic perspective, from what I
Well, to Chris, you're a privacy advocate, you're an academic, you study these issues, you've heard what the business world wants. What are your concerns about this vision for, localization as a trade barrier? Data wants to be free. Is there a problem?
There can be, yes. So the problems that you can run into, in particular with the partnership, there are suggested changes to the way that domain names are registered. So that currently in Canada, if you're an individual, non-commercial, you can have anonymous information. So right now, that is one way of generating data, one way that Canadians expressing themselves. That could change. With regards to local data flows, in British Columbia, we do have laws that limit government data flows, and actually, to an extent, commercial data flows as well. In the case of government, consent has to be received from all people who have the data going over the border. So in the case of when it's just Chris Parsons' data moving across, it can actually go there by consent. The challenge that comes out is when you have multiple people that are attached to it. So when I mention your name, you have to consent before the data can be stored in the United States for government service.
But sketch out for us here, what is your nightmare scenario? What is it that you're afraid will happen if this provision is included in the TPP?
I would hesitate to use the word fear, because I think that's perhaps a bit stronger. The concern is that data that enters the United States is subject to, entirely understandably, different legal regimes. And as a result, some of the protections for the due process that a Canadian might enjoy may not be enjoyed when data is sitting on a United States server. And so that's the origin of the British Columbia law in particular. And how exactly to address that is very challenging. So we have, as Commissioner Stoddard is aware, some of the agreements with Canadian and American government about data flow transfers to law enforcement, but it's not exactly clear what exactly is happening there. And for regular Canadians that aren't involved in high-level diplomatic negotiations, it's very hard to even understand the contours of how this data could, may, or will be used. And so there is a monumental lack of transparency. With regards to the Trans-Pacific Partnership in particular, most information admittedly comes from leaked documents, which we don't know as often anymore, and also statements from trade representatives. So together that means that the governments, some of the largest governments in the world, are engaged in negotiations that will reshape important democratically decided decisions without the people who actually help democratically decide those laws know what's going on. That's the issue. It's not just a trade issue, it's a democratic issue. And I don't think that that's been addressed adequately yet.
Well, I'd like to ask Commissioner Stoddard, Jennifer. So can you situate the Canadian privacy regime in a global context? We've got one regime in the European Union, one regime in the United States, and for those who don't follow this, I mean, those have been at loggerheads now for years, whether it's, what information the United States wants to gather from airline passengers or from the banking system. And there is a view in Canada that the United States privacy regime is not as stringent as the Canadian. I don't know if that's empirically true, but I'd like to get your thoughts on where Canada fits in, and after 10 years, where you think it should head.
Thanks. Yeah, I think Canada's privacy law for the commercial sector, put aside the public sector, and the reference that you made to, limiting where information could be sent had to do only with information that Canadians would give to the Canadian government. So in terms of commercial data flow, Canada adopted about 14 years ago a very, very flexible law that I've spent a lot of time explaining to our European colleagues. And it basically says data can flow freely, except those that send it, called the data controllers in jargon, have to make sure that it's treated outside Canada according to Canadian standards. And those are basically OECD Fair Information Principle standards. So it's not very complicated. And this has allowed Canada, because the preamble to Canada's law says, in order to further electronic commerce, this is a commercial law. So we say, fine, we do not restrict data flows, but those that send data outside the country have the responsibility to make sure it's treated in a third country with, for example, the security safeguards that are required under Canadian law. The Canadian law is honestly getting a lot of interest internationally in the latest version of the European regulation. I don't know if I dare mention that word because temperatures will rise, but they talk about accountability as being a useful principle in data protection. There is a certain amount of interest in American think tanks and American business to trying to move towards an accountability model, because instead of doing prior checking, having things called binding corporate rules, having a big administrative burden ahead of time, there's no administrative burden. It just says, this is the law, like many other laws. This is the law, do it. If we find you're not doing it, yes, there's a problem. What do I see for the future and what do I hope is going to happen? I think the Canadian law has to be strengthened. It has to be strengthened because many of its commentators, notably those who are on the other side of this Data Protection Act debate, go, well, how do you know what they're doing with Canadian data when it's sent anywhere? Well, the answer is I don't. And so just last week, as I near the end of my 10-year term, I said, we have to look more like the Federal Trade Commission. We need more attention from those that are dealing with Canadian data, and we know the Federal Trade Commission gets major attention when it decides to act. We apply the same principles as the Federal Trade Commission, so I hope that's where the government will go.
But do you agree with the critics who say that the protections for privacy in the United States are not as strong as in Canada, and therefore we should be worried about these trade agreements?
That's a very, very complex debate, and I won't say yes or no. It's different. The problem is that many of the people who say this live in systems based on parliamentary democracies. The democracy in the United States is not a parliamentary democracy, it's set up in a different way. So I always personally thought there was as much privacy protection in the United States, but it's different. It's set up differently, the mechanisms are different, and it looks different, and that is what's a bit, I think, disconcerting to some of the people in other countries that don't recognize how these protections can work.
Well, I'd like to bring in the voice of Michael, who actually works in the real world with these issues, not at the policy level, but actually works for BlackBerry. How do you deal with varying privacy regimes across different countries, which sometimes not only are different, but almost in conflict with what they require of you?
Yeah, and it's a good point because I am coming at it from a bit of a different angle here because we're building products which get used within all the different regimes around the world, and by customers who may have operations in quite a number of countries around the world, and in some sense, we're trying to help them actually meet what those different needs are there. You're right, some locations may have very specific laws thinking about privacy. In the UK, you might have voice recording requirements, if say you're in the financial sector. But if you're in say parts of other parts of the EU, that may need be strictly forbidden because of where you are then as well. And I think part of it comes from I think a lot of the mobile industry being kind of coming from that space of everything you do is emanating all around the world anyway. And so when you're thinking about designing products, borders in some sense are more about a map. They're not about reality of data flows, which are actually happening then. Similarly, data which is sitting on the internet may travel any particular way depending on what's the least cost. And so, if we're going to provide a product to customers, we have to assume that data can go anywhere, and hence design accordingly to provide the types of privacy protections our
Well, here's the
customers
question.
expect.
So the bottom line then, does that mean that the country that has the strictest data privacy protection laws becomes the de facto standard that you have to design for because there's a chance that your user might use it in that country?
Effectively, yes. The way, now, for anyone who's providing products that want to be used globally, they aren't going to provide a specific country or country product. It has to meet the needs of the strictest requirements that are out there then.
Very interesting. So now what happens when in Canada you have a province that has a stricter regime, such as British Columbia, and the federal government negotiates a trade agreement? What happens to that province's localization requirements for servers? Are they just overwritten, or is there a way to preserve them?
Yeah, I don't know that the two intersect directly because the two Canadian provinces, and I believe Quebec has some kind of restriction too, so I think there's 3, but this goes to public sector information, again, information that you give to your health authority, which is provincial in Canada, to the tax, local taxes, things like that. This is public, basically, public sector information. So when Canada negotiates trade agreements, as I understand, it's in the commercial world, Canada couldn't negotiate those things because of the division, like in the United States, between state power and federal power. So I don't think there's a direct connection.
And also, Jonathan, you've been quoted as saying that part of your negotiating position in the TPP is not only that data should flow freely, and that should be the presumption, but that somehow you can assure the member countries that they'll be able to enforce their own laws. So how do you do that? How can a country maintain its own domestic laws and still allow this free flow of data?
It's not easy. I think, as opposed to the EU, who generally says, well, here's a law, put this legal framework in, and that will be the equivalency, or as they call adequacy, that ensures that adequate protections are maintained. What we are working with, and I believe Canada in APEC has been a partner on this, is to say, let's put the onus on the company. Let's have the company that is moving the data to say, whatever the regime is in the US, I, as the holder of the information, the company, will take on the obligations that you set within your country. So we're not trying to short-circuit a sovereign decision on the level of privacy a particular country sees as appropriate. What we're saying is, whatever that level is, it shouldn't be a bar to data leaving the country, because companies can undertake to protect it to that level, as I think Canada has done. And in the US, we have the benefit of having a very effective Fair Trade Commission who will enforce some of these undertakings. So the APEC model is they've come up with what they think are the core elements of privacy that map to the members that have joined this group. And the FTC says if a company makes a representation that they'll live up to those standards, and they don't, we in the US are willing to enforce essentially what is a requirement set by the
Well, Chris, one of the things I hear you saying is this isn't the forum where we should be setting our privacy policy. And I've heard other critics use the word policy laundering, that things get decided through trade agreements and people feel they haven't had a chance to maybe think them through or weigh in. What you're hearing here today from Jonathan, does that give you comfort with what's going on? Is his answer?
So, I mean, my aim is never to say that I don't think that people are acting in bad faith. I don't want to believe that. I don't believe it until I see it, and I haven't. However, I know that with regards to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, members of the civil advocacy community, it isn't one group that stood up and said there might be a problem, in which case, maybe it's one group. All around the world, there's a concerted effort to just be at the table, to know what's going on, and to have a voice. And that hasn't happened. And so we have advocacy groups that are, tend to not be well funded, and they've seen this as a real issue. So when the trade negotiations go on, they are sending people to have separate events, to effectively protest about being locked out. So I don't think that it's necessarily the aim to short circuit. However, the unintended consequence can be that the trade negotiation facilitates one aim of things, and it's the primary aim of what's going on. It makes sense. But as a byproduct or as an externality, it ignores other bits and pieces. Okay. And so that's the concern, is that people don't have a seat at the table to say, you want to change this one piece and it will affect Canadian law in this way, or Canadian policy in this way. Let's figure out a way that we can find a way to meet that. And rather than finding that, we're just, we're not there. We're not at the table.
And Michael, one issue that comes up when I talk about this with Canadians is the national security requirements in the United States. People are worried that their data will flow and will find its way into the hands of the FBI or DHS. You, like other companies, you get requests from law enforcement in the United States, and there was recently reports that the FBI wants to really overhaul its surveillance power with regard to the internet. They feel that they're losing access that they used to have over the phone networks because so much communication is happening over the internet. Can you talk a little bit about how you deal with those requests? And one thing is DHS in the United States, another thing would be the government of China or another repressive regime around the world.
Yeah, and the approach that we've always taken is very much looking at what is the rule of law around the world. The reality is there's any global solution, you are used in many different places around the world then. But I think what's interesting there is that there's an expectation from any global company, so a user of that type of technology, that they do have encrypted communications. There's an expectation that they do have that ability to communicate, whether within a country or externally as well, in a secure fashion there. And it behooves us to develop products that allow that to take place then, because whether a company is in Canada, in the US, or anywhere else, they need to be able to effectively do commerce over a mobile device or any other computer means, and that requires security to do that.
And what do you think, Bill? I mean, to what extent are these security requirements on the one hand from the government, on the other hand, security demands by users? We don't want to be hacked. We don't want our emails hacked. How does cybersecurity figure into the broader trade and economic picture?
I think it's a huge problem and a growing one. And I think if government on the economic and commerce side and the private sector don't get together and figuring out how to deal with it, the train is going to be taken over by the law enforcement community with outcomes that will make everybody's life more difficult because they have a different set of priorities. But I'd also mention first that the conversation is not always about what it seems to be about. Privacy is this great value that everybody's for. Security, everybody's for in the abstract. That doesn't mean that everything the government does in the name of privacy or security is about privacy and security. In our experience, sometimes it's about protection. This is not a Canadian analogy, but I can think of some other countries where...
Can you give us an example?
No. Not on the record. But there are countries that are very interested in forced localization, data within the country servers.
Is this a growing phenomenon?
Yes, it is, in terms of demand. And they're interested for a lot of reasons, some of which have nothing to do with privacy. One is they want to support their domestic, hometown industry. They want to support their data server industry. They also oftentimes want to be in a position to be able to access the data more easily themselves as a part of the government, not necessarily legally, but we have governments that don't always operate legally. So they have that problem as well. And some governments simply are outright interested in censorship and want to control the whole process every step of the way, and find that it's much easier for them to do that if everything is within their borders. Likewise, on the security side, a lot of things are done in the name of security that go way beyond what I think anyway are the actual needs of security. But you're right, security is also one of these two-edged swords. It's very important to the government. Nobody wants to be hacked. If you read the press lately about what's been happening in the United States in terms of Chinese hackers of defense contractors and things like that, there are really serious security issues that go on here. But likewise, individuals don't want to be hacked. When they buy something, they don't want their credit card information to end up somewhere else, which is a genuine privacy issue. One challenge is trying to develop rules and protections to separate the phony issues from the real ones. And the other issue is trying to find effective ways to deal with security on the real side. And I think there it ends up being inevitably a partnership that's private and public, because these tools are primarily private, if not entirely private in most countries. The government doesn't own and operate the internet. I mean, Al Gore didn't invent it either, but regardless of who invented it, these are private sector activities. There needs to be a partnership, and I think two things have to happen. The government has to recognize the limitations on what it can accomplish, which is really a statement to the law enforcement community. The private sector, though, needs to step up and accept the responsibility of doing more than it has been to develop sound security systems.
Okay. I'd like the audience to start getting their questions ready, and I'm going to ask one question of Jennifer, and then we'll go to the audience. And that is, one thing I've been covering for years now are these government-to-government efforts between the United States and Canada to come to some kind of agreement about how they will share data and how they will protect it. So when you're crossing the border, you have to give certain information, and what can the U.S. government do with that information? You were involved in setting some of the principles for the Beyond the Border Agreement, the latest iteration of this. There was a lot of mistrust over the years. Now we have news that this exit entry data collection system pilot project has been a success. So have these efforts built trust between Canada and the U.S.? Have they raised new questions? And what else can we do to build the trust that is really the foundation of any kind of data sharing?
I noticed in the time I've been Privacy Commissioner that there's a huge growth in trust between the U.S. and Canada on privacy issues. When I took over this job in 2003, we had no contact with anybody either in Homeland, our counterparts in Homeland Security, or at the Federal Trade Commission or the Department of Commerce. Now we have very close ties in all those areas. We know that legally they're not quite the same, but we work together, I'd say, somewhere in our office, probably on a weekly, sometimes on a daily basis, sometimes now in carrying out, just a couple of weeks ago, we carried out something called an International Privacy Suite. This is in the area of commercial privacy. Do your privacy policies say what they should say? And what they should say is basically the same in the US and Canada and some 18 other jurisdictions around the world. Well, this was largely with the help of a network that had been that came out of the OECD and had long been serviced by the Federal Trade Commission. So in my area, there's a huge growth in trust, and we exchange employees, we send people to common training seminars, we work together. I work very close together with the American delegation, as I did with the European Union delegation, being Canadian too, but we get along very well with the American delegation at the OECD, where new basic rules for fair information principles were just renegotiated in rather a difficult context, but we finally came to an agreement. So I'm very optimistic about Canadian-American cooperation in this area.
Well, that's interesting, because it didn't start out that way after 9/11, that's for
No,
sure.
no.
Yeah, okay. I'm open to questions from the audience. Go ahead, sir. The mic is right behind you.
I have a question about facial recognition software and video images, because you talk a lot about data. And I saw this, I think it was on 60 Minutes, they talked about, a mall could capture an image of people walking and create these databases. Well, who owns that image? Does the government have the ability to go to a Facebook page and withdraw someone's image, or a LinkedIn picture? All these issues come up in privacy now and I'll give you the example, the Boston bomber was captured on video. And so it's sort of an open question in terms of,
Yeah.
is that being considered as well?
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's been there forever. I mean, facial recognition can be either very interesting or very freaky or both, depending on how you look at it. But it's just the latest iteration of personal information, which maybe in the 19th to the 18th century was your address. And governments have always been able to access that from private corporations, depending on the legal regime. In places like Canada and the US, usually you get a warrant for that kind of thing. If it's a national security issues, the requirements may be lower. So yeah, I think that's kind of a standard feature. The issue is how high is the threshold? How safe are those images kept? So law enforcement may be one thing, hackers are another, out and out, you know, subversive forces are another. Who's using these images without people's consent for what purposes? That's a different question in commercial law. But can basically national security forces get access to personal information in democracies? Yes, they can, providing they jump through the right hoops. And the debate's all about what hoops do they jump through.
But I think what you're getting at is it's a different model, though. It used to be that your private information could be summed up, put into a folder. Now we're leaving tracks all over the internet, our photographs, our interactions with other people. And there's this capacity for data mining, whether it's the Obama presidential campaign figuring out what magazine you read, what time you open your emails, how much money you give so they can target you, or it's law enforcement seeing whether your IP address has some link to some safe house in Pakistan or going through logs of phone calls. So does that call for just a different way of thinking about privacy?
Well, we are starting to think about privacy differently and trying to say, how do the old rules about consent? How can you consent when you're walking down a street and there's cameras taking your pictures?
Is
But
that even
should
relevant
they
now?
be-
Is consent
Well,
relevant?
it depends on the countries. As you know, I had a certain debate with Google when they started Street View here, because the rules on taking people's pictures in public are not the same in all countries. So there are various limits, there are rules that apply and so on. But as we move towards the benefits of big data in trying to find more precise answers in the amount of information that's flowing out there, how to preserve people's control over their own personal information, or if not, their direct control, how to put ethical limits on what can be done with their personal information is a challenge. And certainly, in terms of national security forces, I come back to the fact that there are rules. There was a big debate in Canada recently about something called lawful access, which would lower the threshold to getting IP addresses. We were told IP addresses, it's just like a name in a phone book. Just don't worry about it. Well, we did some research. It's hugely revealing what's in an IP address. And so our government moved backwards on that legislation because people are concerned about untrammeled national security, access to all this personal information, starting with what's on the web about us.
Can we get a question from this side of the room? I guess I saw a hand. Was it? Okay, over there, ma'am. You got the mic, great. Oh, you've got it already, great, okay.
I wanted to ask a question of Mike. You got away without telling your name. My name is Holly Porteous. I'm from the Library of Parliament.
Hello.
BlackBerry, the usual phrase that comes with after the name BlackBerry is sets the gold standard in terms of security. You guys have gone out there and you have got the certifications for your products, FIPS 140-2, common criteria. I'm curious to know what your views are on the recent changes that have taken place to the common criteria product evaluation regime. The phrases dumbing down come into play.
Yeah, and so I assume what you're getting at there is some of the differences in terms of, I think they're even look at changing kind of even how they're doing some of the evaluations there on CC. It's interesting because what I think was always great about common criteria was that it was as close to a global standard on security that we had. One of the challenges with common criteria was always that it would often become basically I attest that I'm doing what I say I'm doing, but I'm the one who's defining what it is that I'm doing, and so I see things, pockets where different countries are starting to come up with protection profiles looking at particular, again, I'm coming from a mobile side of the house, so looking at very mobile specific things. You don't need for people who don't know, EAL is the level of common criteria things, but I don't need a high level firewall in a mobile device. But I do need to think about how I'm sharing information, especially as we come into the cross-border discussions we have there. Our approach has always been use as large a framework of certifications as the customers we have, because quite honestly, common criteria is recognized by 27 countries, I believe, around the world, and we sell in 190-ish countries, and so we need to be able to work all across the world then as well. So definitely we'll keep working within it. We're active members of the CC program there, and hoping to stay very close to how that program evolves then. But certifications are extremely important to customers.
It's interesting that the word dumbing down that you used. Jonathan, how do you keep the trade negotiations basically from agreeing on the lowest common denominator when it comes to what governments can do to protect privacy? Because I hear that criticism a lot, not just with regard to privacy, but other issues when you talk about trying to come to common regulations on any number of things.
I think the analogy that was raised there is the standards world. So what I think we can do in the trade world is to reference the best minds that, whether it's in the product area, have come up with what achieves a given objective. And it's not the lowest common denominator. It is a global standard the government then recognizes as useful for it as well. In the privacy area, as Commissioner Stoddard was saying, we have things like the OECD principles, which have set for, 20 years, right? Basic understandings of what an appropriate
so
level of...
that's the net.
There is a common basis for countries agreeing with each other. This is a baseline that you may have to build upon, but it is a baseline. But the trade rules don't do well when they try and get prescriptive. They don't do well when they say this is the answer to a particular solution. They really work better at a high level that gives the governments flexibility to adjust to their national needs, level of development, sensitivities that are different from country to country. But what we add in the trade context is we want some accountability from the government. You want the government to be able to enter into a conversation with a trade partner that says, does that really meet the objective that you say is
So
really
what is
necessary?
the accountability here? Someone can sue the government if they think they're not living up to this?
Ideally, you don't sue them first, but you have a conversation. And work through if they've got an open process. We do a lot of work filing in the domestic processes of other governments that are developing their own rules. And then if it really is something that we think is being done for protectionist reasons, that there really isn't a justifiable reason, then we often want the right to challenge under dispute settlement.
So let's get into the real politics of this for a second. You have countries like Australia and New Zealand who have been reported to have a lot of concerns about this language that the U.S. is pushing. Now, in the case of, for example, airline data, there was a dispute between the United States and the EU, and the United States basically said, well, either give us this data or you're welcome not to come. And so the U.S. had the leverage in that discussion and basically got the information it wanted. In another dispute, it had banking records. The servers were in Belgium, and the Belgians said, we're not going to give you the information you want. And that was the end of that because they had the leverage. So what is the leverage in this negotiation, in the TPP?
We're not going to force other governments to see the world the way we see it. I mean, the idea is to be able to respect a national regime, to find the code word is interoperability. And I'm not sure it always is precisely defined, but is to allow differences among countries, but still allow trade to flow across the borders.
What do you think, Bill, on that issue of leverage? Do you feel that the business community in the United States has more leverage than other countries, less leverage?
Well, I don't think they look at it as a sense of leverage. Bigger economies have more leverage than other economies just by the fact that they're large, they have a lot of consumers, they have a lot of users, and they have a lot of service providers. So inevitably they end up being oftentimes standard leaders. I don't think the business community is uncomfortable with the approach that Jonathan just articulated. And he's in a much better position than I am to talk about the Australians and the New Zealanders. I just think that in any kind of a negotiation like this, one of the issues that you end up having to think about if you're a small country is how is this going to affect my ability to do business with the larger market? And it's not that anybody in the United States is threatening that. It's just an inevitable consequence of size.
And I wonder, Michael, does this system work for you? The way we're having these negotiations that are somewhat behind closed doors, and Chris has said he's not comfortable with it. He doesn't like it. You're going to be directly affected by whatever the outcome is. Is this the best system? Is there some other way this should be done? What do you think?
Well, like I said, I'm in the product area, and so I get to enjoy the outcomes that come from this. From when we were designing products, simple in design is always easier. That's why we're talking about free-flowing information across borders, because it simplifies how we need to think about designing products then, because otherwise you're increasing cost and complexity for users then. The approach that we always are taking, because we're thinking about not just necessarily different markets in terms of countries, but also different sectors within the different markets there. The financial sector may have different requirements in these areas than the government sector, and government in military versus healthcare, and et cetera, et cetera. And so, any product company that is servicing these industries here already has to deal with the complexity of managing through different regimes. So certainly, simplest is always best from our perspective.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah, go ahead.
This is people are probably going to boo when I say this, but I have to say, after 20 years working for congressional staff and then 8 in the American administration, and I started out as a big fan, but I'm no longer a fan of open covenants openly arrived at. In my experience, most of the time when people complain about the process, they're not really complaining about the process, they're complaining about the outcome. Or they're complaining about they're worried about what the outcome is going to be. And so they want to change the process because they want to change the outcome. My experience with open negotiations, if you will, where everything is laid out, is it produces an enormous amount of posturing and makes getting an agreement much more difficult than if you go behind closed doors. And I mean, my companies may not agree with me on all of that because they are as much in the dark as the NGOs are as far as the progress of some of these things. But I have to say, if you want to get an agreement, at the end of the day, you've got to go behind the curtain and do it. And if you don't do it that way, if you try to do it out there where everybody's watching, you won't end up with an agreement.
Well, what do you think about that, Chris?
I think that trade policy isn't delinked from democratic good governance. Just like the sharing of information isn't a discrete thing, it's part of a larger discussion. And so the risk, the problem is that it isn't necessarily that civil society has to be at every single, they don't have to have a seat at every place, but they do have to be involved. And locking people out is not the way to develop trust in the economic relations that are being built. And these are not, just pie in the sky, they will affect trade and nothing else. I mean, in Canada, they will have implications for Canadians that publish online. They could have implications for the ability for good, honest security researchers to do their work. Because if there are any protections around software, security researchers will be prohibited from analyzing it without first getting permission from the company. That increases vulnerabilities actually in the same companies that are sharing data across different networks. These are issues civil society has brought up. And perhaps these are being heard and they're being incorporated somehow in the negotiations, but
Jonathan?
there's no transparency.
We have an open door. We meet with civil society. I've got a meeting scheduled next week, I believe, with the groups that are coming in that have strong views, in this case in the EU. I think there's a lot of misinformation, and to the extent that, by necessity having closed-door negotiations stokes misinformation, it is our job to get out there and change them.
Any more questions? Right here. Yeah, and then the gentleman behind you later.
I've got one.
Hi, I'm James Cullen. I'm the Chief Technologist at WestJet. So I was just wondering, if we take the PCI standards for credit card protection, which is probably the closest we have to a cross-national standard worldwide. Could we look at governments working with the PCI Council to get some of their experience to look at standardization in the privacy area as well?
I'm not an expert on the PCI standard, but there is, as you know, the ISO standards. And we have had for the last 8 years an accredited technologist to the various ISO committees that have different numbers and that meet in exotic places around the world to try and come to an agreement on many of these privacy, and they're mostly privacy security standards. So I would say, and we're kind of act as the Canadian representative on those committees. So I'd say we're doing that already.
Yeah, I'd see that.
Go ahead.
With the PCI Council, payment card industry, for those who are not familiar, they have a workable sort of cross-national capability and experience in doing that. So it's not so much setting the standard, but the experience in implementing this in a workable way across international borders. I think they have a lot of experience. It's become fairly easy to comply for organizations now, and there's workable documents that allow this to happen. So it may be a melding of the ISO standards with the PCI standards or best practices may give us a workable solution that's compatible with most government requirements, at least for protection of information as opposed to legal or law enforcement access, which I think is a different issue.
Did you want to weigh in on that, Michael?
Yeah, and I don't have a huge amount of familiar with PCI. Specifically on that, as a product company designing a product, it comes a little bit targeted in terms of kind of what the overall solution is. That PCI is looking at some very specific parts of that, and then kind of back-end infrastructure pieces there. I guess the challenge that we run into there, and it was partly related to the question from the lady back there on common criteria as well too, is if you're building a product that is going to work in a global context as well, unless everyone in the world agrees to that one, then you're also going to have other things which may not necessarily even intersect with that completely that you still need to comply to, and then basically you're building up complexity upon complexity as a company to satisfy all the different regimes. Then hopefully they all interact well together, but they may not.
I think you had a question over here. Go ahead.
Is this working? Okay. My name is Sebastian. I'm the legislative assistant for Charmaine Borg, the digital affairs critic for the official opposition. So my question is for the privacy commissioner. It's actually relayed from her, so this is more or less her question. Some of it might be obvious, but I think it's worth maybe investigating a little bit further and unpacking a little bit further. Obviously, the conversation is very much between a question about regulation and a question about free data flows internationally and so on. Given the position paper that you released last week, what would you see as your new relationship, the new relationship of your office as the regulator with business, if the proposals that you outlined in the position paper would be enacted into Canadian law, into PIPEDA specifically? What would that new relationship look like in terms of ensuring a better arrival at achieving the accountability principle?
Okay, thank you for your question. When I launched this, it was said by 1 out of 30 representatives of Canadian business that this would more or less spoil the good relationship of my office with the business community. I don't think it need to. We're not into the business of getting people or punishing them or fining them for the fun. But what we have noticed is that there are many organizations that don't take us seriously. So for that reason, we need more, I think we need more power. But over my tenure, we've concentrated on working with the business community, doing guidelines, making reasoned conclusions that help to shape the way forward. I don't think we have an acrimonious relationship. Sometimes we've agreed to disagree, very rarely. And I think that would continue. But the process needs to be speeded up. We need more attention, and we need companies building in privacy protections at the beginning, paying attention to what's in Canadian law, rather than saying, oh, if the commissioner investigates, well, then we have so much time and by the time she goes to federal court, well, we'll have time to fix it. It's that kind of behavior that I want to change.
I want to follow up on that. At the beginning of this conversation, David Jacobson, the U.S. ambassador, said that it's important to have Canada and the U.S. aligned on these issues. Do you agree with that? And how much alignment are you comfortable with between the two countries?
I think it's very important to have us aligned. I mean, it's clear that we have a huge trading relationship. As I said, I administer a commercial data protection law. It's very clear. We see eye to eye with most things at the FTC. Where we don't, it's nuances. I mean, they have a different regime. They have 5 commissioners. They have a multiplicity of priorities. They're basically a consumer protection agency. But putting that aside, we agree on the basics. And I think that's very important going forward because, as some of people on the panel have pointed out, you have a huge assortment of approaches, of experiences, of types of regimes across the world that we're all trying to juggle and bring them into a kind of common corridor of privacy protection. And certainly I think between the US and Canada, there's a huge commonality of practice and of interest, and that's very positive.
Is there a question over here? All right, this side of the room has all the questions. All right, I'm sorry, Bill?
I want to ask Jennifer and Chris, what do you do about the cloud?
In what sense?
How does this affect your thinking? I mean, here is this large thing that's not exactly in Canada or necessarily anywhere else, or might be in Canada today and in the United States tomorrow and in India next week.
Well, who has
How do
jurisdiction if
deal
you
with it?
have, say, 3 people collaborating on a project in 3 different countries for a company that's based in a 4th country, and maybe the servers are based in a 5th country? Whose legal regime applies? Is it just the real politic of, the guy who can shut it down the fastest gets to impose his rules?
You phrased it better than I could.
Okay.
Excellent.
Well, thanks.
If I can, so I just completed a research project actually funded through the Privacy Commissioner's Office on social media and the way that they deal with data, so cloud services. And Canadian privacy law has extraterritorial reach, and this has been affirmed by the federal court and has been seen in the Privacy Commissioner's actions. So what we found was there were instances where companies were arguably non-compliant with very basic things. So can I request my data? Can I request the data that you hold about me? And so I think that cloud creates problems. It's incredibly complex. But we need to at least start with the most basic problems. Can I get access to my data? When I delete my data from a service that I work with, maybe I've outsourced to a cloud provider for documents or something like that. When I delete my stuff, does it go away? And in fact, that isn't always the case. There's a series of companies that provide cloud-based services and say, no, we guarantee that you won't see it, but we will always have it. And so this creates problems in the sense that it's not terribly obvious to end users that this is the case. Often you have to do a technical analysis. And those are the sorts of things that have to be addressed. And that's a technical problem. I don't think that it's just trade, it's not just privacy, it's just not law enforcement. These things have to come together, and it's very hard, it's very complicated. And we don't do that by keeping people out of rooms. We come together, actually at events like this, and we try and develop a dialogue to raise awareness and subsequently address these problems.
What do you
Okay. Actually, my office has published guidance on the cloud, quite extensive guidance. Basically, we're not against clouds. We don't say to Canadians, don't use clouds, because obviously there are huge cost savings, efficiency, and so on. We say, if you use clouds, this may happen. There may be these issues. So basically what we were telling groups or people, but mainly it's organizations like municipal governments and so on, look carefully at the terms of service that the cloud is using, is offering you, because often these are very big countries who could say, organizations that say, sign here, that's it, the cloud. Try and negotiate Canadian standards, negotiate what you expect. And it's not a take it or leave it, you have some leverage with cloud providers. But and sometimes we say you might find it useful to form your own local cloud. Clouds come in I gather in all shapes and sizes and types. So we say, look at clouds critically and beware these are the implications of using cloud, like any other new technological form.
So you're not saying you can go and enforce Canadian law in the cloud. You're saying buyer beware, Wild West
No, we're
cloud.
saying be very careful. We have not yet, that I can think of, done a cloud investigation. But doubtless that will come if necessary, and there are the problems, and we have either reasonable grounds, that's a legal requirement, or somebody comes with a complaint, we will investigate how Canadian information is held in the cloud. But we haven't done that. That hasn't come up yet.
It's a fascinating issue because I was at a conference in D.C. some months ago on negotiations over this international services agreement. And I think there's a minister, I think, from Costa Rica, and she was saying, my country has a competitive advantage, we feel, in accounting services. I'm pretty sure it was accounting. And we really want this agreement so that our accountants can get work from all over the globe, not just this very small country of Costa Rica. And so if you have an accountant in Costa Rica marketing its services to Canadian companies, presumably, they're not going to set up servers in Canada. They're going to somehow do it on their own services or in the cloud. So this becomes a really huge issue for them, as well as the companies that may consider, sending them their financial data to get their taxes done or whatever. But what kind of security can they be assured that they have? And I think what you're saying is, well, we can't guarantee you anything from the Canadian point of view.
Well, we say, if you are sending, you as an organization are sending Canadians' personal information to Costa Rica to be accounted by professional accountants, know that in the agreement you make with those accountants in Costa Rica, you somehow have to bring in Canadian data protection standards,
So it's a
which
matter
are honestly
of
not too complicated. They're
contract
basically
enforcement, but not government
OECD
regulation.
standards, which includes that people have the right to their personal information and correction and, and so on. So it's not really all that complicated, and that's why a lot of the countries now in Central America and South America are moving to data protection regimes in order to get a lot of this international outsourcing business.
Very interesting. I think we have time for one last question very quickly. Anybody? Okay. Actually, I see we're at 0-0. Okay. Thank you so much to our incredibly distinguished panel.
Good time.
And for all your very interesting questions.